Good evening, friends. Tonight, we journey across the windswept plains, castle ramparts, jungle paths, and desert sands to uncover a part of history that too often remains hidden. In the great scrolls of war and empire, one group stands in the shadows, overlooked but never absent, the women who took up arms. Their names were seldom recorded. Their stories, if told at all, were tangled in legend. And yet, they stood on ships beside Viking raiders, on war elephants in Indian jungles, behind fortress walls in Europe, and among tribal warriors fighting to keep their people free. These were not women of peace. They were warriors. They were queens and rebels, archers and riders, generals and defenders. Some are remembered in myth, others in stone and scroll. Some were called unnatural, some were hailed as saints, but all of them shared one thing. They fought not for glory, but for survival, for justice, for those they loved. In this series, we will walk beside them. From the fierce shield maidens of Scandinavia to the noble sword bearers of Japan, from Berber queens to samurai rebels, we will tell their stories slowly, with respect, care, and wonder. So if you enjoy soft storytelling and real history, please consider subscribing and liking this video. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time you usually fall asleep. It's always lovely to see how far these stories travel. Now take a deep breath, let the noise of the day fall away, and prepare to drift back in time. This is the world of forgotten women warriors. The north wind howled across the fjords, whipping salt spray against the carved hulls of dragon-prowed ships. These were lands forged in iron and ice, where life was hard, loyalty was sacred, and battle was not just a necessity, it was a calling. And in this warrior culture of 9th century Scandinavia, there are whispered tales of women who stood shoulder to shoulder with men, axe in hand, shield at the ready. They were the shield maidens. Our story begins with one of the most famous among them, Lagertha. To the modern world, Lagertha is most recognizable as a dramatic figure of television, clad in stylized armor, her hair braided and bloodied. But long before screenwriters gave her form, she lived in the ink and parchment of sagas. Most notably in the Gesta Danorum, written by the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus. In the 12th century, Saxo, a Christian man writing in Latin, did not admire warrior women. He often criticized them, calling them unnatural or unruly. Yet even he could not deny the power of the story that Lagertha inspired. According to Saxo, Lagertha was a woman of exceptional courage. She first appeared when the legendary Viking warrior Ragnar Lodbrok was traveling through Norway. Ragnar, still young, had come to avenge his grandfather's death, who had been slain by the king of Sweden. The Swedish king had also captured many women of noble birth and forced them into a brothel. Lagertha was one of those women, but instead of submitting to shame, she took up arms. When Ragnar began his campaign of vengeance, a strange company of warriors joined his cause, women in helmets and armor, fighting not with desperation, but with training. Among them stood Lagertha, silent and fierce. Saxo writes that she fought with the courage of a man and the spirit of a lion. In one of the most vivid moments of the saga, Lagertha is said to have turned the tide of battle when the men began to falter. With sword in hand, she cut down enemy ranks, rallying Ragnar's forces. Impressed, Ragnar sought her out, not as a prisoner or a rescued maiden, but as a partner. He courted her, though according to the tale, Lagertha did not yield easily. She placed a bear and a great hound at her door to ward him off. Ragnar, in true saga fashion, slew both beasts to win her hand. They married, had children, and for a time, they lived a warrior's domestic life. But this was not a fairy tale. The marriage did not last. Ragnar later left her to marry another. Yet when he called upon her aid once again in war, Lagertha answered. She brought a fleet of 120 ships, according to legend, and led her warriors into battle once more, saving Ragnar yet again. She did not do so out of love, Saxo implies. but for honor and perhaps pride. Eventually, Lagertha returned to her own lands, where she ruled in her own right. Saxo claims she murdered her second husband with the point of a spear and seized his throne. Whether this was villainy or justice, the text does not say. What it does make clear is that Lagertha was a woman who answered to no man. So who was she truly? Was Lagertha a real historical figure or a composite of many warrior women remembered in oral tradition? Historians debate this question to this day. While no physical evidence ties a specific grave or runestone to Lagertha, her story endures because it matches a broader pattern, one that archaeology is only now beginning to confirm. In recent years, archaeological discoveries in Scandinavia have lent weight to the idea that women in Viking societies did, at times, fight. Not in overwhelming numbers, perhaps, but not as fantasy either. One of the most important discoveries came in Boudica, Sweden, the site of a 10th century Viking town and burial ground. There, in 1889, archaeologists uncovered a grave filled with weapons, armor, and 2 horses. For over a century, it was assumed to be the grave of a male warrior, because how could it not be? It was a warrior's tomb, outfitted with the trappings of command. But in 2017, DNA analysis shocked the scholarly world. The skeleton was female. The so-called burqa woman became a symbol of how assumptions, both ancient and modern, can obscure the truth. Some scholars pushed back, questioning whether she had truly been a warrior or whether the grave goods were symbolic. But others pointed to the arrangement of the burial, its prominence, its martial contents, its pairing with sacrificed animals, as evidence that this woman had earned her resting place through blood and rank. And so, the world of Lagertha, once dismissed as myth, began to take on new shape. Shieldmaidens may not have formed legions, they likely did not dominate Viking armies, but it is now increasingly accepted that some women did fight and that their stories were remembered with both awe and anxiety. It's worth noting that Norse culture was not uniformly egalitarian. In many areas, women were expected to keep households, raise children, and manage trade in the absence of their husbands. But Norse law, especially in Iceland and parts of Denmark, granted women property rights, divorce rights, and legal agency that far surpassed those of their contemporaries in Europe. And in times of war, when towns were burned and kinfolk killed, it is entirely believable that women trained in hunting, riding, and defense would take up the axe. Their image remains carved in stone and echoed in saga, strong-backed, fierce-owned, gripping round shields and curved swords. In our next part, we will turn from Lagertha's legendary exploits to the archaeological evidence behind the burqa warrior woman, and to other real-life finds that suggest Viking women, while not common in war, were never entirely absent from it. Their legacy lives on in the wind that howls through the longships, in the sagas passed from hearth to hearth, and in the quiet strength of the women who refuse to be left behind. The windswept island of Boudica sits in Lake Mälaren, Sweden. Quiet today, but once a bustling Viking trading hub, alive with the clang of metal, the scent of salt and fur, and the distant sound of oars slapping water. It was here over a century ago in 1889 that archaeologists unearthed a grave, tomb B281, filled with weapons, armor, and 2 horses. It was everything one would expect of a respected warrior's final resting place. A sword placed at the side, arrows bundled carefully, a board game for strategy in the afterlife. For over 100 years, no one questioned the bones lying beneath the earth. A warrior, obviously, and just as obviously, a man. But science has a way of unraveling assumptions. In 2017, a group of researchers conducted DNA testing on the bones and discovered something that shook the historical world. The skeleton was female. There was no ambiguity. The warrior buried with such honor, tools of command, and signs of high status was a woman. She became known as the burqa woman, and her grave forced scholars, museums, and textbooks to ask a very difficult question: had we been wrong about Viking women all along? For many, the discovery was exhilarating. Here was real, tangible evidence, not a saga, not a tale, but a body buried with the respect given to a leader in battle. Others were more cautious. Some scholars suggested that perhaps the grave goods had been misinterpreted, that they were symbolic, or that the woman had not actually fought but held a ceremonial role. But those theories met resistance from both archaeologists and historians. The tomb was not symbolic. Its contents were placed illiberately. The arrangement matched other warrior graves, not priestly ones, not traders or merchants. And the presence of two horses, one bridled and one sacrificed, pointed to a person of high rank, a commander, someone worthy of taking their steeds into the afterlife. Even the presence of a game board, likely for tactical planning, implied a strategic mind. This was not a fluke. It was a challenge to a long-standing assumption that warriors in Viking society must be male. And while the burqa woman remains the most famous, she is not alone. Scattered across Scandinavia are other female remains found with weapons. Their interpretation has always been tentative. Often, when a grave contained a sword and female bones, the assumption was that the sword was placed as a symbol, maybe for her husband, maybe a relic, perhaps a status item. Rarely did anyone dare suggest that the woman herself had wielded it. But with burqa, that wall began to crack. And when one looks more closely at Norse sagas and law codes, a clearer picture emerges. Though not common, female warriors were not entirely fictional either. Some sagas speak of skieldmaidens, or shieldmaidens, women who donned armor and joined battle. While often romanticized, their inclusion suggests a cultural memory of such figures. Sagas often mix the fantastic with the real, but they don't invent societal roles out of nothing. They draw on the familiar. In the saga of Hervor, we meet a woman who disguises herself as a man to seek out a cursed sword. She is a warrior in every sense, bold, defiant, skilled with weapons. In other tales, like the Volsunga saga, female fighters are presented as tragic heroines, fighting in doomed causes but still fighting nonetheless. Some historians believe these stories reflect a real subset of Norse women who, in extraordinary circumstances, the death of husbands, defense of homesteads, vengeance, took up arms and were remembered for doing so. After all, the Viking world was not one of standing armies and rigid ranks. It was a world of raiding parties, family-driven war bands, and opportunistic battles. In that kind of setting, there was space for the unexpected, for a woman to pick up a spear when needed. Further clues lie in the grave goods and runestones spread across the Norse world. Some inscriptions name women with titles of respect: landowners, seafarers, even masters of the house. In certain poems and carvings, female figures stand tall with shields in hand, surrounded by symbols of war and fate. Yet the history of Viking women in war is not only about who held the sword, it's also about who held the power behind the sword. Norse women often controlled land, managed estates, and conducted trade while their husbands were away. In Iceland, women could initiate divorce, reclaim dowries, and serve as witnesses in court. Some even oversaw settlement expeditions, managing entire families and crews. Power in this world was not always found on the battlefield, but it could be. And when we examine the world of Viking warfare, we find that battle was not just brute strength. It was strategy, morale, resilience. These were qualities not limited by gender. In fact, the warrior ideal in Norse culture, bravery, loyalty, defiance in the face of death, was something women were also taught to admire and emulate. Sagas are filled with women urging men to vengeance, goading them to action, and, in some cases, joining them. Could these be echoes of real women who refused to stay behind? Could the tale of Lagertha, the grave of the burqa woman, and the scattered whispers of shieldmaidens be fragments of a truth we only now begin to see? We may never know the full number, we may never know every name, but the evidence now tells us this: at least some Viking women fought, and were honored for it. Their shields may be buried, their stories half erased, but their courage survives, in the sagas, in the soil, and now in our retelling. In the next segment, we will dive into other tales of shield maidens. Not just Ligurtha or the woman from Burka, but lesser-known figures who fought in epic battles like Bravalla, or who appear fleetingly in Norse poetry and myth. Because in the Viking Age, as in so many others, war did not always wear a beard. In the land of rising mist and ancient mountain paths, where cherry blossoms fall like whispered prayers onto polished armor, there once lived women whose blades sang alongside their male counterparts. Warriors of fierce devotion, silent resolve, and deadly precision. They were known as the Onabugeisha, female samurai of feudal Japan. Though history would come to revere the image of the male samurai, with his katana, his strict code of bushido, and his solemn poems before death, the truth is that women also trained in the arts of war, particularly in times of unrest, when men were called away or their clans were threatened. Women of the samurai class were expected to defend their homes, not with cries for help, but with the keen arc of a blade. And among them, one name rings out like a war cry across centuries: Tomoe Gozen. She lived during the late 12th century, in the violent twilight of the Heian period, when civil war had erupted between two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. These were years of shifting loyalties, ruined temples, and blood spilled in rice fields, and in the midst of this chaos stood Tomoe, not in the shadows, but on horseback, sword raised. She served under Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a powerful general and her rumored lover, though the chronicles are careful to never quite clarify. She is described by the Heike Monogatari, the epic account of the war, as especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features, but more importantly, as a warrior of unmatched skill. Tomoe was a woman of great beauty, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god, mounted or on foot. These are not the words of flattery, they are recognition. Tomoe Gozen was not a token nor a curiosity. She commanded troops, led charges, and is said to have taken the heads of many enemies in battle, the highest proof of martial skill in samurai culture. In the Battle of Awazu, she fought valiantly even as her lord's forces collapsed around her. Tradition holds that she slayed a famous warrior named Honda no Morishige, dragging him from his horse, wresting him down, and beheading him. In that same battle, Yoshinaka is said to have ordered her to leave. Whether this was to protect her, preserve his honor, or to die alone is unclear. Some say she obeyed, disappeared into obscurity, and became a nun. Others claim she fought to the bitter end, disappearing into legend only after exacting fierce vengeance. But one thing is certain, her name was remembered. And that alone is a miracle in a world where women were often brushed aside in ink and stone. Tomoe was not alone. The Onabugeisha emerged as a recognized warrior class, particularly during Japan's earlier feudal periods. Unlike the later Edo period, where women were increasingly restricted to domestic roles, the earlier centuries demanded more of them. Especially during the Genkai War, the Sengoku era, and local skirmishes that often left homes and castles vulnerable to attack. These women were often trained in the use of the naginata, a pole weapon with a curved blade. It was particularly suited for women not because it was weaker, but because it allowed reach and power regardless of size. In skilled hands, a naginata could unhorse riders, dismember attackers, or defend narrow gates for hours. Onabugeisha were also skilled in archery, horseback riding, and the use of knife-like weapons such as the kaiken, often kept hidden in their robes. Their training was not merely symbolic, it was a matter of life and death. If the men of the house were away at war, it was the women, mothers, sisters, wives, who stood between the home and destruction. We have records of noble women leading peasant levies, of women defending castles while under siege, and of wives avenging slain husbands with calculated precision. One example is Nakano Takeko, who lived centuries after Tomoe, but continued the legacy of female samurai during the Boshin War. But her tale comes later. In temples, scrolls, and family chronicles, these women appear not as ornaments, but as defenders. One 16th century account describes a woman who, after her husband was assassinated, trained in secret for years and then killed all 12 conspirators, one by one, during a festival, disappearing before anyone could stop her. Such tales were often whispered, rarely shouted, but they lingered. The role of the Onna Bugeisha declined during the long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate 1603-1868. As the samurai class became more ceremonial, their swords more symbolic, women's roles were redefined around ideals of submission, grace, and household duty. Yet even then, in quiet corners of castles and rural dojos, women continued to train. Some did so for family honor, others in secret, teaching daughters what had once been their mother's rights. And a few, like the Aizu domain's women's militia during the 166th domain, took up arms again when Japan was dragged into war once more. In the next part, we'll explore the cultural expectations placed upon these warrior women, how Confucian ideals clashed with martial necessity, how Tomoe's story was reshaped through art and poetry, and how later historians struggled to define her legacy. Because to be an Onna Bugeisha was not only to fight, it was to exist in contradiction, to be a blade in a world that demanded silence. As the dust of centuries settled over Japan's turbulent feudal era, so too did silence fall upon the names of its warrior women. By the early Edo period, when peace reigned and the rigid hierarchy of Tokugawa society took hold, the memory of women like Tomoe Gozen began to soften into folklore, mythologized, romanticized, and finally tucked away into the margins of samurai history. Tomoe, once remembered as a fierce general, was reimagined through kabuki theater, woodblock prints, and poetic verses as a tragic heroine. Brave, beautiful, loyal, but no longer a military tactician. Her sword, once heavy with blood, became symbolic, her battlefield a stage. In many woodblock prints of the 18th and 19th centuries, she is shown in elaborate armor, often poised or gesturing softly, her face serene, stylized, constrained by the ideals of femininity. Yet even in this reshaping, her presence persisted. Artists could not erase her entirely. They merely reinterpreted her, a subtle nod to a deeper truth the culture could not forget. In this way, Tomoe became something of a folk memory, a thread of resistance that continued to inspire women even in eras that sought to limit them. Beyond art, the role of the naginata was preserved in ceremonial and educational contexts. Girls from samurai families were still taught to wield it even when they were no longer expected to see combat. The weapon itself became a symbol of feminine martial virtue, the graceful curve, the elegance of movement, the silent promise of protection. But despite the official shift toward domesticity, the warrior spirit of the Onna Bugeisha did not vanish. It simply went underground, becoming part of the private identity of many noble women. Even among Buddhist convents and aristocratic households, stories of female warriors were preserved in quiet ways. Monastic chronicles, letters, and oral traditions carried forward the legacy of defiant women who had once stood at the walls with blades in hand. Some female-led martial schools continued in rural areas, often passed from mother to daughter. Techniques were taught discreetly, with the understanding that their purpose had changed, not for open war, but for defense, honor, and sometimes revenge. In the late Edo period, Japan faced the looming shadow of Western imperialism, and with it came internal conflict. The Boshin War, 1868-1869, fought between imperial loyalists and the Tokugawa shogunate, became a brief flashpoint when the old ideals of the samurai, including the Onna Bugeisha, resurfaced. It was in this moment that Nakano Takeko, a descendant in spirit of Tomoe, took the field. Takeko was born in 1847 into a well-educated samurai family, trained in the Itori style of naginata combat and fluent in Chinese classics, She embodied the best of traditional training and personal discipline. When the Aizu domain, loyal to the shogunate, was besieged during the Boshin War, Takeko could not remain behind. Denied official enlistment due to her gender, she formed a volunteer corps of women fighters, many of whom were teenagers or wives of samurai who had already gone to war. These women, dressed in traditional garb and armed with naginata, fought under the banner of Aizu with fury and desperation. Taka herself was reportedly responsible for dozens of kills during the Battle of Aizu, but like so many of her kind, her story ended in blood. Struck by a bullet, she asked her sister to cut off her head, lest the enemy take it as a trophy. Her remains were buried near the temple of Hokkaiji in Fukushima Prefecture, where even today a statue honors her courage. Though often left out of military histories, Takeko's story is remembered locally, and each year during the Azuorum festival, a procession of girls in hakama and armor march in her honor, their naginata gleaming in the autumn sun. Such commemorations reflect an important shift. In recent decades, there has been a revival of interest in Japan's female warriors. Scholars have re-examined texts, artifacts, and oral traditions. Martial arts schools have elevated the role of the naginata not just as a cultural exercise, but as a symbol of empowerment. Books, documentaries, and even anime have rediscovered figures like Tomoe Gozen and Nakano Takeko, not as relics, but as real women who fought, bled, and led with the same strength as any man. Yet their memory still walks a fine line between the real and the reimagined, the battlefield and the stage. In many ways, the story of the Onab Geisha is also the story of Japan's complex relationship with gender and tradition. Women warriors were never the norm, but they were never entirely absent either. And even when forgotten by politics and patriarchy, they lived on in the whisper of blades, in old paintings, in temple records, and now in us. As we close this part, we must remember that to honor them fully, we must resist the urge to romanticize them into impossibility. They were not myths. They were people, trained, fierce, forgotten, and now remembered. In the next module, we will journey into the heart of South and Southeast Asia, where queens rode war elephants, tribal women ambushed invaders, and the fire of resistance burned bright even under foreign rule. History, as always, is broader than we are told. And the warrior women of Asia are waiting to be heard. The monsoon winds drift gently over the highlands of central India, brushing through forests where stone forts rise like old sentinels above the land. In this landscape, not the gleaming courts of Delhi or Agra, but in the thick jungles of Gondwana, rode a queen armored in steel, bow in hand, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her name was Rani Durgavati, and she was no passive ruler behind palace walls. She was a warrior, a widow, a mother, a strategist. And in the year 1564, she would ride into history not as a victim of empire, but as its defiant opponent. Born in 1524, Rani Durgavati was the daughter of Chandal Rajput nobility, raised in the traditions of hunting, horseback riding, and martial training, as expected of many royal girls in warrior clans. Her early education included both the Shastra and Shastra weapons and scripture, as the lines between the two were often blurred in the Rajput worldview. Honor, loyalty, and death on one's own terms were not simply values, they were expected outcomes. She married into the ruling family of Gondwana, a kingdom in the tribal heartlands of central India. The Gond people, an Adivasi community, had their own traditions of martial resistance and regional authority. Together with her husband, she ruled as queen consort until his death left her a widow at age 23. But this was no quiet morning. Durgavati became regent for her young son, overseeing the affairs of the kingdom and commanding its defenses. Her advisors urged caution, diplomacy, tribute, but the queen saw what was coming, the slow expansion of the Mughal Empire, pushing deeper into India under the reign of Emperor Akbar. When Mughal General Asaf Khan marched toward her territory, demanding surrender, Durgavati refused. Not symbolically, not quietly. She raised her banners, rallied her generals, and prepared her army of tribal archers, cavalry, and foot soldiers for battle. According to Persian chroniclers and Indian ballads alike, she rode into battle atop an elephant, leading from the front, visible, unshaken, and defiant. It was not for glory. She knew she was outnumbered. Her army was significantly smaller, less equipped, and lacked the heavy artillery of the Mughals. But surrender was not an option. In the battle that followed near Narai, her forces fought with ferocity, using the terrain to their advantage. They struck from cliffs, ambushed supply lines, and resisted every push. Rani Durgavati herself was wounded but continued fighting, until a final arrow struck her neck. Rather than be captured, she took her own life with a dagger, preserving her honor and that of her people. Her death was mourned, but it also became legend. In the forests of central India, her name became a rallying cry for resistance. Even today, the Rani Durgavati University, a district, and many statues across Madhya Pradesh bear her name. She was not an exception in South Asian history, merely one of the few whose tales survive. In many parts of India, queens, princesses, and tribal women were expected to defend their lands. Warrior queens like Rani Abaka of Ulal, Rani Velu Nachiyar of Sivaganga, and Keladi Chennamma of Karnataka all led forces into battle, not as symbols but as strategists. They were trained in Kalari, martial arts, horseback riding, swordsmanship, and diplomacy. In Kerala, women of noble birth practiced Kalarapayattu, one of the oldest martial arts in the world. In Tamil Nadu, oral traditions still celebrate the memory of women who fought colonizers, rival kingdoms, and even their own usurpers. And among the tribes of northeast India, the Khasis, Nagas, and Meiteis, women often served as both guardians and warriors. Their roles weren't exceptional in these societies, but customary. In Southeast Asia, the pattern continued. The Khmer Empire, based in modern Cambodia, honored goddesses of war and power. Some inscriptions from the Angkorian period describe royal women managing garrisons, fortresses, and economic supply chains. The Khmer, like their Indianized neighbors, viewed female strength as complementary to male power, a duality, not a contradiction. In Vietnam, the memory of the Trung sisters, Trung Trak, and Trung Hy looms large. These sisters led a massive rebellion against the Han Chinese occupation in 40 CE. Trained in martial arts and military strategy, they gathered an army of 80,000 and temporarily established an independent Vietnamese kingdom. They wore armor, rode elephants into battle, and were eventually defeated only by overwhelming force. Their legend persists not as a footnote, but as a national myth. In the Philippines, Princess Uduya was said to have led a fleet of ships and warriors. Though partly legendary, her story reflects a cultural memory of female military leadership in the kingdom of Taulisi, possibly a part of Pangasinan. Chinese sources mention encounters with her army, and later Spanish missionaries found oral traditions about her courage and rule. In Thailand, the 18th century figure Queen Surothai donned armor to fight alongside her husband against invading Burmese forces. Riding into battle on a war elephant, she died defending her king. Her story, too, is preserved in monuments and royal chronicles. These women of South and Southeast Asia share more than martial prowess. They share a fierce autonomy, often rooted in cultural expectations that allowed or even demanded female leadership in times of crisis. They were not always loved. Many were challenged, betrayed, or isolated. But they were remembered. And in the dust of old palaces, among the roots of banyan trees, and in temple songs whispered by old women, their stories lived on. In the next part, we will explore Rani Abaka of Ulal, the queen who would not surrender, who led guerrilla warfare against the Portuguese in the coastal swamps of Karnataka, and became one of India's earliest anti-colonial icons. History remembers kings in robes and crowns, but sometimes it was queens with bloodied swords who stood in their place. Along the humid, salt-laced coasts of Karnataka in southwestern India lies the old town of Ulal, a place where palm trees sway, temples whisper old prayers, and the sea still crashes against a shoreline that once saw flames, cannon fire, and rebellion. In the 16th century, this was the realm of Rani Abaka Teuta, a queen who would not kneel. She ruled as part of the Teuta dynasty, a Jain royal family that gave significant autonomy to women rulers. Abaka was not merely a ceremonial queen, she was sovereign in her own right. Crowned at a young age, she had been trained in warfare, archery, swordsmanship, and most importantly, in diplomatic strategy. Her small kingdom sat on a vital port, making it a target for Portuguese expansion. And the Portuguese came expecting to conquer as they had done in Goa and other coastal strongholds. They sent emissaries with demands and fleets with threats. Rani Abaka refused to pay tribute. This was not a rash decision. She understood the stakes. The Portuguese, armed with superior naval firepower, had reduced entire towns to ashes. Yet Abaka formed alliances with neighboring rulers, mobilized her troops, and used intimate knowledge of coastal terrain to her advantage. Her forces, a combination of trained warriors, tribal groups, and even fisher folk, launched guerrilla-style attacks on Portuguese ships. They struck at night, vanished into mangrove swamps, and burned supply routes. More than once, Abaka led these raids personally. The Portuguese tried to install puppet rulers. They failed. They tried to storm Ulao. Her people repelled them. They even tried to capture her in battle. She escaped and returned fiercer than before. In one major offensive, the Portuguese governor of Goa launched a massive fleet to destroy Ulao. The queen, instead of retreating, launched a surprise attack at night, burning parts of their fleet and killing hundreds. According to local accounts, she fought on the battlefield, barefoot and bloodied, refusing to abandon her soldiers. Eventually, she was betrayed by members of her own family, but even in chains, she refused to submit, dying in prison, but leaving behind a legend that outlived the empire she defied. Even today, in Karnataka, her name is sung during Dasara processions. Her statue stands tall, and school books teach her not as a myth, but as a mother of resistance, India's first female freedom fighter. From the rainforests of the Deccan to the war camps of Southeast Asia, similar stories echo. In Tamil Nadu, Rani Velu Nachiyar, the queen of the Sivaganga estate in the 18th century, waged war against the British, long before the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. After her husband was killed by colonial forces, she escaped into hiding, formed alliances with local rulers, and trained an army in exile. What makes her story especially remarkable is her use of intelligence networks. She employed spies to infiltrate British ranks, mapped their munitions, and eventually launched a successful campaign to reclaim her kingdom. She even assembled a female army unit known as the Udayayal Regiment. In one daring attack, her trusted commander, woman named Khawla, smeared herself with ghee, set herself ablaze, and stormed a British ammunition depot, causing massive explosions. Khawla is often cited as one of history's earliest recorded female suicide bombers, not driven by fanaticism, but by strategy, sacrifice, and vengeance. Velu Nachiyar ruled for several years after her return, issuing decrees defending her territory and refusing to acknowledge British supremacy. Further south, among the Maravar clans and hill tribes, women often took up arms as a matter of duty. Oral ballads in the Tamil countryside speak of sisters, daughters, and widows who fought when their men were killed or fled. In Southeast Asia, too, the tradition of warrior women extended beyond royal courts. Among the Dayak people of Borneo, women sometimes led headhunting raids, not as anomalies, but as part of warrior culture. Among the Batak of Sumatra, women were known to wield spears in defense of village honor. In the kingdom of Aceh, in modern-day Indonesia, Sultanah Taj ul-Alam Safiatuddin Shah ruled for 34 years in the 17th century, navigating her nation through colonial pressures from the Dutch East India Company. While not a frontline fighter, she led with political cunning, and her court included female advisors and military commanders. In Burma, Myanmar, during the Konbaung dynasty, royal women sometimes led defenses of fortresses and organized logistics for war campaigns. The Burmese chronicles describe women assisting in artillery units, overseeing troops, and even negotiating prisoner exchanges. While these stories vary in detail and preservation, they reveal a shared truth. In times of threat, gender did not excuse anyone from duty. In some societies, women warriors were celebrated. In others, they were only remembered in folk songs and whispered stories, but they existed, marching, fighting, commanding. Why then have they been forgotten? One reason lies in the patriarchal nature of written history. In many regions, especially under colonial rule, records were compiled by male officials and foreign observers who dismissed female leadership as aberrant or unworthy of documentation. Another reason is that many of these women fought on the losing side, against empires, invaders, or colonizers who later erased them from state narratives. But memory, especially in the East, has other guardians. In village festivals, in temple carvings, in stories told by grandmothers around firelight, these women endure, not always by name, sometimes just as the queen who fought or the girl with the bow, but they endure. And now, in the age of rediscovery, their stories are finding voice once more. In the next module, we will turn to the ancient Mediterranean world, a land of myth and marble, where legends like Artemisia I of Caria, Penthesilea of the Amazons, and the mysterious gladiatrices of Rome offer glimpses of a forgotten martial sisterhood. Because from the jungles of India to the coasts of Anatolia, warrior women have always been there, buried beneath conquest and convention, but never truly gone. The Aegean Sea shimmers beneath a pale sun, its gentle waves lapping at the coasts of Asia Minor, where the rugged hills of Korea rise behind ancient harbors. Centuries ago, in a world fractured by war and shifting alliances, a woman stood at the helm of a warship, eyes fixed on the horizon as the fate of empires was decided by ore and fire. Her name was Artemisia of Halicarnassus, and she was both queen and admiral, a rare woman in a world ruled by kings. Her story begins not in myth, but in the recorded scrolls of ancient historians. Born in the late 6th century BCE, Artemisia was of Greek descent, but ruled a Carian satrapy, a region under Persian dominion. She inherited the throne of Halicarnassus after her husband's death, and governed on behalf of her young son. But Artemisia was no passive regent. She became the trusted naval ally of Xerxes I, king of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, during the most pivotal confrontation of the Greco-Persian Wars. The year was 480 BCE. The Persian king had launched a massive invasion of Greece, and the two sides prepared for a decisive naval clash at Salamis, just off the coast of Athens. Artemisia's involvement was unusual. In the Persian fleet of hundreds of ships drawn from Phoenicia, Egypt, and Asia Minor, only one squadron was commanded by a woman. Yet it was her squadron that won Xerxes' trust and admiration. Her participation was not ornamental. She was an active strategist and tactician, advising Xerxes on whether to engage the Greek fleet in open sea. According to the historian Herodotus, a fellow Halicarnassian who likely had access to first-hand accounts, Artemisia urged caution. She warned that the narrow straits of Salamis would nullify the Persians' numerical superiority. But Xerxes, swayed by his other advisors, rejected her counsel, a mistake that would cost him dearly. As the battle commenced, Persian ships crowded into the bottlenecked waters. The faster, more maneuverable Greek triremes struck with precision, ramming and boarding with deadly effect. Confusion and wreckage spread across the sea. Yet amidst the chaos, Artemisia distinguished herself. According to Herodotus, at one point during the battle, her ship was pursued by an Athenian vessel. With no room to flee and no hope of escape, she rammed and sank a friendly Persian ship in a calculated deception. The Athenians, believing she had switched sides or was one of them, broke off pursuit. Xerxes, observing from a high promontory, reportedly exclaimed, "My men have become women, and my women men," a line both admiring and telling of how deeply her valor impressed him. She survived the battle, which was ultimately a catastrophic defeat for the Persians. Many ships were lost, and the momentum of Xerxes' campaign faltered. Yet Artemisia's own actions were praised, not only for bravery, but for sharp decision-making. In the aftermath, she advised Xerxes again, this time suggesting he retreat to Asia and leave a trusted general to continue the war. He followed her advice. Her fate after the war is unclear. Some accounts suggest she was rewarded richly by Xerxes and returned to rule Halicarnassus in peace. Later legends, likely fictional, claim she fell in love with a man who spurned her and in despair leapt from a cliff into the sea. But the historical Artemisia, as recorded by Herodotus and others, emerges not as a tragic romantic, but as a rational, effective leader, both feared and respected. She defied many categories of her time: a Greek woman ruling under Persian authority, a queen commanding men in naval combat, a counselor whose advice was better than that of kings. But Artemisia was not alone in Mediterranean history, merely the most well-documented. In this region where East met West, where myth blurred with politics, women of noble rank occasionally seized power in times of instability or war. Sometimes they ruled openly, other times they influenced events from behind palace walls. And in some cases they fought. In the next part, we'll journey into myth, memory, and recorded warfare, to explore the legend of Penthesilea, the Amazon queen who fought Achilles at Troy, and what her story tells us about women, warfare, and myth-making in the ancient world. History is not only written by the victors, it is often shaped by who is allowed to speak. Artemisia spoke with her sails raised, and her rams sharpened. The year was 229 BCE, and across the Adriatic Sea, the cries of seagulls mingled with the creak of wooden ships, sails snapping in the salty wind. Along the rocky Illyrian coast, fishermen mended nets, traders filled amphorae with wine and oil, and pirate sails blackened the horizon. Among them sailed a woman who ruled not from behind palace walls, but with wind in her hair and a sword at her belt. Her name was Teuta, and to the Roman world she was a menace, a queen of pirates, who defied their power and nearly sparked a war that would echo for centuries. Her story began in the rugged, mountainous region of Illyria, a confederation of warrior tribes nestled along the eastern Adriatic, in what is now modern-day Albania and parts of the Balkans. In this world of shifting loyalties, sea raids, and fierce independence, leadership was measured not in titles, but in strength. Teuta was the wife of King Agron, ruler of the Argii tribe and commander of a formidable navy. Under Agron, Illyria grew powerful, its warships patrolling the coastlines and extracting tribute from passing merchants, especially those from the wealthy Greek cities to the south. But Agron's ambitions outpaced his health. After a victorious campaign against the Aetolians in 231 BCE, he celebrated with heavy drinking and died soon after, leaving the throne to his young son. And so the mantle fell to Queen Teuta, who assumed the regency. She did not shrink from power, she expanded it. Teuta inherited not just a kingdom, but a thriving naval empire, built as much on piracy as on trade. Illyrian ships, swift and narrow, darted across the Adriatic, capturing Greek merchant vessels, and striking fear from Epirus to Euboea. Unlike many rulers who viewed piracy as a shameful necessity, Teuta saw it as a natural extension of Illyrian sovereignty. Raiding had always been part of her people's tradition. To her, the sea was not governed by treaties or polite diplomacy. It was free, and her ships claimed its wealth. This bold stance quickly drew the ire of Greece, and more dangerously, Rome. The Romans had recently begun expanding their influence eastward, and trade routes through the Adriatic were critical to their ambitions. When Illyrian pirates began attacking Roman and allied Greek ships, complaints poured into the Senate. Rome at this time had not yet become an empire, but its pride was vast. They dispatched 2 ambassadors to Teuta's court, Gaius and Lucius Coruncanius, tasked with demanding that she restrain her pirates and submit to Roman expectations. What followed was legendary. The Roman historian Polybius claims that when confronted by the ambassadors, Teuta listened politely and then informed them that Illyrian law did not prohibit piracy. and that her people were free to enrich themselves as they pleased upon the open sea. She would not interfere. Outraged, one of the envoys reportedly spoke with open contempt, insulting the queen and threatening Roman retaliation. Teuta's response? According to some sources, she had him assassinated on his way back to Italy. Rome was enraged. In 2029 BCE, the Roman Senate declared war, marking the beginning of the First Illyrian War and Rome's first military engagement across the Adriatic. Legions were launched, not just to punish piracy, but to crush Teuta's growing influence. Yet the queen did not cower. She ordered her ships to blockade key Greek ports and launched preemptive raids. For a brief time, her forces even besieged the important island of Corcyra, modern Corfu, threatening to cut off Roman naval movement in the region. But the Roman war machine was relentless. Their army landed in Apollonia, allied with local Greek cities, and marched through Illyrian territory. One by one, Teuta's allies defected or surrendered. After months of fighting, she was eventually forced to retreat to Rhizon, a fortified city on the coast. It is there, surrounded and cornered, that she agreed to surrender. But even in defeat, Teuta negotiated like a queen. The terms were humiliating. She was allowed to remain as ruler over a reduced territory, but had to promise to abandon piracy, reduce her naval fleet, and pay tribute to Rome. Yet she was never executed, never paraded as a captive. The Romans, despite their fury, acknowledged her as a sovereign ruler, one who had dared to stand against them. After her surrender, historical records fall silent. It is believed that Teuta ruled over her remaining lands for some years before fading from view. No grave has been found, no statues survived, but in Illyrian legend, her name endured. To some she was a villain, a pirate queen who dared kill a Roman envoy. To others she was a freedom fighter, a woman who refused to yield to foreign empires, who commanded fleets and warriors in a world that left little room for female power. Today, in parts of Albania and the Western Balkans, Teuta is remembered as a national hero. Her name appears on coins, ships, and monuments, and in the waves that crash along the ancient coastlines she once ruled, her legend sails still. She was not perfect, she was not gentle, but she was bold, and she was undeniably sovereign. Long ago, when the winds howled across the moors of Britannia and Roman legions marched on stolen roads, a woman rose from the ashes of betrayal to shake the empire to its core. Her name was Boudica, and though she ruled for only a moment in time, her fire still burns in the bones of Brit. She was queen of the Iceni, a Celtic tribe that occupied the lush, rugged lands of what is now eastern England. Boudica was no stranger to hardship. Her people lived under the shadow of Roman occupation. Though the Iceni had once made peace with the conquerors, peace with Rome was always conditional. A balancing act of tribute, diplomacy, and quiet resistance. Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus, had tried to play the game. He ruled as a client king under Roman authority, and upon his death around 60 CE, left his kingdom to be jointly inherited by his daughters and the Roman emperor, hoping to protect his people from reprisal. But Rome did not honor the deal. Instead, they seized the land outright, looted the kingdom's wealth, and punished the royal family. As an example, what happened next was brutality of the cruelest kind. Boudica, queen and widow, was publicly flogged. Her daughters, teenagers, were violently assaulted by Roman soldiers. Tribal nobles were enslaved. Their sacred groves were desecrated. Their ancestral lands stolen. The message was clear: submit or be crushed. But Boudica was not made for submission. She rallied her people, calling on the gods of war, the ghosts of the forests, and the fury of every insult the empire had dealt them. She painted her face in woad, clad herself in a thick woolen cloak pinned at the shoulder, and raised her voice before the Iceni. "We fight not as slaves, but as warriors. Better to fall in freedom than live in chains." And the people answered. Other tribes joined her, the Trinovantes, the Cornovii, and countless others who had simmered in quiet resentment. Her army swelled into the tens of thousands, Farmers, craftsmen, hunters, mothers, not trained soldiers, but people with nothing left to lose. They marched south. Their first target was Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, the Roman capital in Britain. Once a proud outpost, it was now filled with settlers who had driven out native Britons. Boudica's army burned it to the ground, slaughtering the Roman population and razing the temples. The flame had been lit. Next came Londinium, modern-day London, a new Roman town of traders and soldiers. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, seeing that his troops were too few, fled the city. Boudica entered with her legions, and again burned it to ash. The fire raged so fiercely that archaeologists still find a thick layer of red char beneath the city today. They call it the Boudican destruction layer. She moved on to Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans, and again, fire and vengeance. In all, ancient Roman sources estimate that over 70,000 Romans and Romanized Britons were killed. Boudica's fury was not aimed at conquest but retribution. But Rome, though wounded, was not yet broken. Suetonius regrouped his forces, choosing a narrow valley for battle, where Roman discipline and formation could neutralize the Britons' overwhelming numbers. Boudica is said to have ridden in a chariot with her daughters beside her. She addressed her army not as a queen, but as a mother and a sister in grief. I am woman, yes, but my resolve is no less than that of Rome's emperors. I am here to avenge, not to plead. She wore a golden torque around her neck, and her hair, long and red like fire, fell past her waist. The battle was savage. Though her army outnumbered the Romans, the terrain betrayed her. Roman formations held firm, and their tactics, honed over decades of conquest, slowly turned the tide. Her forces were routed, cut down, and scattered. The rebellion was broken. Boudica either took her own life with poison, or died soon after from wounds or grief. The Roman records disagree, but one thing is certain: she was never captured. She vanished like smoke. Though Rome reclaimed its cities, they never forgot the uprising. Boudica's revolt had terrified them, not just because of its scale, but because it had been led by a woman, a mother, a widow, a queen. It showed that Roman dominance was not guaranteed, that one woman's fury could rally tribes, topple cities, and scorch the empire's pride. For centuries, Boudica's name was rarely spoken, but in later ages, as England faced threats from abroad, she was rediscovered. First in poems, then in textbooks, and finally in bronze. Today, her statue stands near the Thames in London, a bronze chariot bearing her figure, spear raised, daughters beside her, looking out over the river she once turned to flame. But the real Boudica, the woman behind the myth, was not forged in bronze. She was flesh and blood and fury, a warrior born of injustice, a queen who did not go quietly, and when the wind blows across the moors of Britain, it still carries her voice, not in words, but in fire. The plains of Troy shimmer with heat, dust swirling where thousands once clashed under banners of fate. In the mythic memory of the West, the Trojan War was a contest of heroes, gods, and men driven by pride and prophecy. But among the bronze shields and spears, one warrior rode, not to reclaim a woman or defend a kingdom, but to honor her dead. Her name was Penthesilea, Queen of the Amazons, a people half real, half legend, whose name has echoed across centuries as both marvel and menace. Her tale is told in fragments. The Aethiopus, an epic poem lost to time but remembered through later sources, places her arrival at Troy after Hector's death. The city was weary, its heroes had fallen, hope was scarce. And then came Penthesilea, towering, proud, clad in armor of foreign make. She brought with her a company of women warriors, riding swift horses and armed with spears, bows, and a burning sense of purpose. The Amazons had not come for riches or vengeance, they had come for honor. Penthesilea, it was said, sought to cleanse herself of guilt. In a hunting accident, she had killed her sister, a tragedy that haunted her. War, she believed, might offer redemption. In Homeric logic, such a thing made sense. The Amazons had long fascinated the Greeks. First mentioned by Homer, they were said to live far to the east, near the Black Sea or beyond the Caucasus. A nation of women who fought, ruled, and lived without men. Greek authors described them as archers, riders, and raiders who mated only to reproduce, killing male infants or sending them away. But whether the Amazons truly existed is still debated. Some historians believe the legends were inspired by the Scythians, Sarmatians, and other nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, where women did ride and fight alongside men. Archaeological finds from southern Russia and Ukraine, including female skeletons buried with weapons and war wounds, suggest that the idea of women warriors was not entirely myth. But Penthesilea was not a footnote. She became the face of this fearsome femininity. At Troy, she charged into battle, slaying Greek warriors and briefly shifting the tide. Her strength was formidable, her technique elegant, her presence terrifying. Then came Achilles. The Greek champion faced her in single combat. The clash was fierce, and in the end, he drove his spear into her chest. And then, according to later poets, he hesitated. In one account, Achilles removed her helmet and saw her face, and in that moment, fell in love. Or perhaps it was sorrow. Or shame. The sources differ. Some say he grieved her death, others say he killed a fellow warrior, and only afterward understood what he had done. In one version, Thersites, a low-born Greek soldier, mocked Achilles for mourning a woman. Achilles killed him on the spot. These stories are not facts. They are interpretations, but they reveal something vital. Penthesilea made Achilles pause. In a culture that glorified male strength and minimized women's roles in war, this moment, however fictional, speaks volumes. It reflects an ancient tension, the awe and fear inspired by a woman who fights like a man, or perhaps better than one. Artists seized upon the image, from 5th century vases to Roman mosaics. Scenes of Achilles killing Penthesilea appeared across the Mediterranean. She was beautiful, yes, but also armed, defiant, and deadly. Some portray her with her chest exposed, weapon raised, eyes locked with her killer. Others show her crumpling under the blow, but always she is central. Her story was a contradiction the Greeks never resolved, a woman who embraced the male domain of war and died for it, yet was mourned, honored, even loved. Outside of myth, there were other women who fought, though their names did not echo as loudly. In the Roman world, gladiatrices did exist, albeit rarely. Inscriptions, reliefs, and satirical poems mention them. One notable relief from Halicarnassus, ironically, Artemisia's city, shows two women, Amazonia and Achillea, squaring off in a gladiatorial match. Both were freed after the fight, a sign that they performed well and entertained the crowd. The Roman Senate eventually banned female gladiators in the 2nd century CE, not because they were ineffective, but because the image of armed women clashed with Roman ideals of femininity and decorum. Yet the very fact they had to be banned proves they were real. Beyond Rome, the Carthaginian general Hannibal is said to have had women in his armies, especially among his allied Numidian and Iberian troops. In the turbulent regions of North Africa and Spain, where cultures mixed and imperial borders blurred, women were often called to arms. Throughout the ancient Mediterranean, warrior queens emerged in times of crisis. Teuta of Illyria, who led pirate raids against Roman ships. Cleopatra, who, though more diplomat than fighter, outfitted fleets and commanded troops. And even Boudica, a Celtic queen from Britannia, who challenged the might of Rome itself, a story we'll return to in a later module. All of them, mythical or historical, represent the persistence of female martial identity in a world that tried to erase it. In the Greek imagination, the Amazon was a cautionary tale. In modern memory, she is a symbol of strength. Penthesilea rode to Troy to die, but she also rode to be remembered. And remember her we have. In the next part of this module, we will meet the gladiatrices of the Roman Empire and explore the paradox of women fighting in the blood-soaked arenas of spectacle, silence, and survival. In the echoing stone corridors beneath Rome's amphitheaters, where blood once ran between the cracks and roars thundered overhead, a hidden chapter of history lingers. One not of emperors or legendary generals, but of women wielding weapons for survival and spectacle. They were the gladiatrices, the female gladiators of ancient Rome. Though they occupied only a sliver of Rome's long and violent performance history, these women left behind enough traces to challenge the assumption that the arena was a strictly male domain. Their presence, rare and often controversial, reveals both the limits and the possibilities of a woman's place in Roman society, especially in its most brutal and public theater. The first question often asked is, did they really exist? The answer is yes. Though their numbers were few and their stories mostly lost to time, Roman literature, inscriptions, and art provide scattered but compelling evidence. One of the most vivid depictions comes from a relief found in Halicarnassus, now housed in the British Museum. It shows two women, named Amazonia and Achillea, engaged in combat, bare-chested and armed with curved swords and shields. Their names, both drawn from myth, suggest a deliberate parallel between their identities and legendary female warriors. What's notable is not just the fight, but the outcome. Both were granted missio, the honorable discharge, given to gladiators who fought bravely. This wasn't a mock duel or novelty act, it was a real contest, witnessed, judged, and recorded. In ancient Rome, gladiators occupied a strange space. They were both despised and adored, slaves and superstars, brutalized and glorified. Women who entered this arena entered not only combat, but a crisis of identity. Their very presence challenged Roman ideals of femininity, which prized modesty, obedience, and domesticity. Yet some women, both slaves and free, chose or were forced into the profession. The Roman poet Juvenal, writing in the 1st century CE, sneered at upper-class women who trained as gladiators, mocking their desire to wield weapons and perform before a crowd. To Juvenal, this was decadence. To us, it's evidence that the phenomenon was real enough to provoke public opinion. Indeed, some female gladiators trained in professional schools, known as ludi, alongside men. They likely used the same weapons, practiced the same drills, and faced the same risks, injury, disfigurement, or death. But make no mistake, these women were also used as spectacle. The Emperor Domitian reportedly staged fights between women and dwarves for entertainment. Other emperors deployed female gladiators in exotic-themed battles, pitting them against animals or each other in carefully orchestrated scenes of chaos. Still, not all female combatants were mere sideshows. Some developed reputations, earned their freedom, and were even granted tomb inscriptions acknowledging their achievements, an honor rarely bestowed. One such inscription, discovered in Ostia, Rome's port city, reads, "Grata, freedwoman of Lucius, who fought as a gladiatrix." The simplicity is striking. No shame, no euphemism, just a statement of fact. She fought. In 2000, archaeologists uncovered a cremation site near London's ancient amphitheater containing the remains of a woman buried with gladiator-type grave goods. Lamps depicting battles, chicken bones, feasting, and remnants of incense. Was she a gladiatrix? The evidence is circumstantial, but it suggests that even in the far corners of the empire, women may have stepped into the sand. It's also worth noting that not all female fighters were gladiators. Some appeared in Venacious animal hunts, where they faced lions, boars, or other beasts. The Roman satirist Martial mentions a woman named Maevia who hunted boars with a spear and bared breast, mocking her for stepping outside traditional gender roles. Yet, for all the satire and scandal, their mere presence on the sands meant that Rome had to grapple with the idea of women as warriors, even if only within the bounds of entertainment. Eventually, the Senate banned female participation in gladiatorial games in 200 CE under Emperor Septimius Severus. The decree cited concerns about public morality, not safety. Women in armor, it seemed, were too disturbing to the Roman imagination, even after decades of cheering for blood. And so the gladiatrixes disappeared. They left behind no memoirs, no epic poems, no statues in their likeness, only fragments, chipped stone, hostile verses, half-buried bones. Yet even these fragments speak volumes. They tell us that women did fight in ancient Rome, not just in defense of hearth and home, but in the heart of the empire's bloodiest stage. They fought for freedom, for fame, or perhaps simply because they had no other choice. And though their stories were buried, the arena remembered. For every shout that once rang through the Colosseum, there was a face behind it, sometimes scarred, sometimes triumphant, sometimes female. In the final part of this module, we'll look beyond the Roman world to the women warriors of Carthage and the resistance against Rome, including leaders like Sophonisba, who defied conquest not with a sword but with intellect, resolve, and a final bitter act of defiance. Because resistance wears many faces. Some hold weapons, others hold poison. As Roman legions marched across North Africa in the final century of Carthaginian power, their spears glinted under the punishing sun, and dust trailed behind them like a warning. The city of Carthage, once a mighty rival to Rome, was in its last days. But before it fell entirely, another story unfolded. One not of generals or soldiers, but of a woman whose name would become legend for her choice to die free rather than live conquered. Her name was Sophonisba. She was born into a noble family in Carthage during the 3rd century BCE at the height of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal's elephants still thundered through Italy and Rome fought for its very existence. Sophonisba was the daughter of Hasdrubal Gisco, a powerful Carthaginian general and statesman. From an early age, she was groomed not just as a daughter of privilege, but as a political asset, destined to play a role in the survival of her people. Her story truly begins in the dying embers of that war. By this time, Rome had taken the fight to North Africa. The Carthaginian ally King Syphax of Numidia, once loyal to Carthage, had married Sophonisba to cement their alliance. But the tides shifted. Massinissa, a rival Numidian prince who had joined Rome, began gaining ground. His forces, with Roman support, defeated Syphax, captured his lands, and eventually took Teuta, the city where Sophonisba resided. Captured, she stood at the mercy of Rome. Massinissa, victorious and politically astute, saw an opportunity. He took Sophonisba as his wife almost immediately after her capture, some say to protect her, others argue it was a strategic move to consolidate his claim. But what came next is clearer. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, wary of any power outside Roman control, was furious. He ordered that Sophonisba be brought to Rome in chains, to be displayed as a prisoner. Massinissa, caught between his loyalty to Rome and his new queen, made a fateful choice. He sent a servant to Sophonisba bearing a goblet of poison. The message was clear: die now, as a free queen of Carthage, or live as a chained trophy in a Roman parade. Sophonisba understood. She took the goblet in hand, raised it without protest, and drank. According to the Roman historian Livy, she said simply, "If my death is the only gift a husband can give me, so be it." Her suicide was seen as noble, even by her enemies. Scipio is said to have praised her bravery, though he never wavered in his conquest. To Rome, she was a tragic figure. To Carthage, she became a symbol of defiance. And to history, she stands as yet another reminder that women, too, played roles in the great political upheavals of the Mediterranean world, often with as much agency, sacrifice, and courage as any man on the battlefield. Sophonisba never picked up a sword. She never led an army. But in a moment when submission seemed inevitable, she chose autonomy over humiliation, control over survival. In doing so, she joined a long line of Mediterranean women whose strength lay not only in war, but in the quiet, impossible choices that history rarely records. Taken together, Artemisia's tactical brilliance, Penthesileia's mythic sacrifice, the gladiatress's physical resilience, and Sophonisba's final act of defiance, we see the full spectrum of warrior identity in the ancient Mediterranean. Some were queens, Some were slaves, some were legend, but all carved their stories into the bones of empire, often in silence, sometimes in blood. And now, thousands of years later, we remember them. Their names might not fill the pages of textbooks, their statues might not line the marble halls of museums, but they stood in the storms of history and refused to be erased. In the burning light of the desert sun, where banners danced in the wind and swords rang like thunder, a figure once rode through the dust, cloaked in black, fearless and swift as the wind. Her name was Khawla bint al-Azwar, and she carved her legend not in poetry alone, but in the clash of steel. Tonight, beneath the calm flicker of firelight, we remember her not as a shadow behind men, but as a warrior in her own right. She lived in the 7th century, during the time of the Rashidun Caliphate, in the early decades after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Her homeland was Arabia, but her story spread across the Levant, to Syria, Palestine, and beyond, where empires clashed and new faiths reshaped the world. Khawla was the sister of Diara ibn al-Azwar, one of the most renowned Muslim fighters of his time. But Khawla was no less fierce. Raised in a warrior family, she learned to ride, fight, and compose verse, an Arab tradition that married bravery with beauty. And though few women took part in battle, Khawla did not wait for permission. She made her choice and rode with her brother's army. One of her most legendary moments came during the Battle of Ajnadayn in 634 CE, a critical conflict between the Muslim forces and the powerful Byzantine Empire in modern-day Palestine. When Dirar was captured by the enemy, Khawla donned a black veil, mounted her horse, and rode into the heart of the battlefield, not to plead for her brother's life, but to fight her way to him. Accounts describe her charging alone into Byzantine ranks, wielding a spear and a curved sword, cutting down soldier after soldier in a fury so intense that her enemies thought she was a man, perhaps a commander. One source says she killed several Byzantine knights and scattered entire ranks. It was only after the fighting paused that her veil slipped, and the astonished men around her realized she was a woman. Their commander, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the famed Sword of God, is said to have exclaimed, "Who is this knight who fights so fiercely?" When he learned it was Khawla, he was not angry. He was in awe. Later in the war, she led a group of women freed prisoners in taking up arms themselves. They had been captured during a campaign and held by Byzantine forces. But Khawla did not wait for rescue. She rallied the women, many of them civilians, and attacked their captors, seizing weapons and escaping. When she rejoined the army, they were no longer seen as mere victims, but as fighters. In another tale, Khawla is reported to have led a cavalry charge when the Muslim army faltered. Her black veil became a banner, her horse pounding through the dust, her voice shouting commands like a general. She was not only a warrior, she was also a poet, a tradition deeply honored in Arab culture. Her verses were composed in campfires and carried through oral memory, war cries, woven with rhythm, pain shaped into words. One of her lines, remembered by tradition, "I am the daughter of the brave. I strike like lightning and tear through shields, not from pride but from duty." Despite her fame, Khawla's life after the wars fades into silence. Historians debate whether she died in battle or lived to old age, or perhaps slipped back into the anonymity forced upon many women of her time. What remains is the impact. She became a symbol across generations of courage, piety, and fierce independence. In Syria, schools and hospitals have been named in her honor. In fiction, she's been retold in plays and novels. In memory, she stands beside figures like Joan of Arc, Tamoe Gozen, and Moulin, a woman who chose the sword when her people needed her. But her story, unlike theirs, begins in the sands of Arabia, in verses and valor. Khawla bint al-Azwar remains an icon not just for what she did, but for what she defied. In an age when women were expected to remain intense, she rode into battle. When armies trembled, she led the charge. When her brother was taken, she fought through enemy lines to rescue him. And when women were told they could not fight, she armed them with courage. She did not seek glory, she sought justice. She did not fight to be remembered. She fought because she believed in something worth defending. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, picture her, cloaked in black, riding through the desert twilight, spear in hand, her words echoing across time like a song of strength. Khawla, warrior of faith. Khawla, flame in the sand, not forgotten, never forgotten. The desert wind moves like memory, quiet, unrelenting, and impossible to outrun. In the sands of the 7th century Maghreb, a woman stood on a rocky outcrop, her eyes sweeping across the arid expanse of her homeland. Beneath her banner, tribes gathered, Berbers, Arabs, Jews, even remnants of Romanized locals. They were not all of the same tongue or faith, but all looked to her. She was Dia, more commonly known as Al-Kahina, the warrior priestess who led one of the last and fiercest resistances against the expanding Islamic Caliphate in North Africa. Al-Kahina's legend begins at a moment of monumental transition. The Umayyad Caliphate, fresh from conquests in Egypt and the Levant, turned its gaze westward. North Africa, what the Romans had called Africa Proconsularis, was not just valuable for its fertile coastlines and trade routes, it was also the last stretch before the Atlantic, the westernmost frontier of the old Mediterranean world. And to secure it meant holding a vast, often rebellious, and incredibly diverse territory. But it would not fall easily. The heart of that resistance pulsed in the Ayos Mountains, a rugged spine stretching across eastern Algeria. There, among forested ridges and dry valleys, lived the Jarawa, a Berber tribe of proud lineage. From them came Dihya, either a noblewoman, a spiritual leader, or both, depending on who tells the story. Her exact origins are debated. Some chronicles describe her as Jewish, others as a pagan prophetess. Some even hint at Christian influences. But what matters more than her creed is her calling, to defend her people's way of life from foreign rule. The Arab chroniclers who recorded her tale, such as Ibn Khaldun, often did so through the lens of conquest, and yet even they could not deny her strength. One described her as a woman of wisdom and great authority. Another called her a queen of great knowledge, feared by all who opposed her. These weren't compliments lightly given, especially by writers from a patriarchal, often dismissive world. In the year 695 CE, General Hassan ibn Umayy Numan, commander of the Umayyad forces in North Africa, marched westward with a seasoned army. He had taken Carthage from the Byzantines. He had defeated all others who stood in his path. But Dayam was different. She didn't meet him in a single battle. She waged a war of attrition. Guerrilla strikes from mountain passes, ambushes under moonlight, caravans intercepted before they reached his men. Her forces knew the land. Her scouts controlled the oases. And after a grinding campaign, she defeated Hassan and forced him to retreat east. It was the most humiliating setback of his career, and for a moment, the Maghreb breathed free. Dihya's victory was not just military, it was symbolic. For the Berber peoples, long under Roman, Vandal, and Byzantine overlords, her triumph meant that an indigenous queen had stood against yet another empire and won. But victories in history are rarely eternal. Hassan returned years later with reinforcements and a deeper knowledge of the terrain. This time, Dihya made a drastic and haunting decision. Knowing that the Arab forces thrived by capturing fertile towns and controlling trade, she adopted a scorched earth policy. Her followers raised farms, uprooted orchards, and destroyed cities rather than surrender them. To some, it was an act of brilliance. To others, desperation. And to many Berbers, especially farmers and traders, it was a line too far. Support began to wane. Desertions mounted, some tribes switched allegiance to the Arabs, others withdrew altogether, the resistance fractured. And when Hassan returned for the final battle, likely near the plains of Tabarka, Dihya stood with only a fraction of her original strength. She fought anyway. According to one version of the legend, her two sons fought beside her, and at the end, after her capture, they were taken to Damascus and raised as Muslims. Another account says she died in battle, sword in hand, and yet another claims she was assassinated by a betrayer from within her own ranks. Her body, it is said, was buried where two rivers meet, a humble resting place for a woman who defied an empire. And yet her legacy endured. Among the Amazigh, the indigenous Berber peoples of North Africa, she became a folk hero. In Algeria and Tunisia, her name appears in textbooks and poetry. Statues commemorate her. Schools bear her name. For Berber feminists and nationalists alike, Al-Kahina is the proof that their people have always resisted assimilation and that women have always stood at the front. But her memory is not without controversy. Arab nationalist historians sometimes paint her as a destructive pagan. Religious scholars debate her faith. Some modern retellings even mythologize her into a witch or a demon, because to remember her as a full person would mean confronting her power. In many ways, Al-Kahina was more than a queen. She was a symbol of cultural identity, of resistance against forced conversion and colonial subjugation. And her relevance hasn't dimmed. In a region still wrestling with questions of language, autonomy, and gender, her figure rises like a mirage, distant, shimmering, but never fully out of reach. She rode at the head of a broken army. She died surrounded. She was outnumbered, betrayed, and erased from official memory for centuries. But she never surrendered. And in that defiance, she claimed something no empire could take: legacy. Long before the modern maps of Nigeria were drawn, the land was divided into city-states, kingdoms, and powerful dynasties that ruled the Sahel, the vast region stretching just south of the Sahara Desert. Among them was Zazzau, one of the original Hassa city-states, ruled from the ancient city of Zaria. It was from here, sometime in the mid-16th century, that a young royal girl named Amina would rise to sit on a throne, but to lead armies and command empires. To the people of Hausa oral tradition, Amina was a legend in motion. In their stories, she is a woman of fire and iron. She rides a war horse into battle. She carves her enemies' names into the dust. She builds walls, not just of stone, but of legacy. But behind the legend lies something even more extraordinary: a real queen who ruled during a time when female leadership was rare, especially in martial contexts, and whose reign became so impactful that even centuries later, her name survives in epic poems, folk songs, and colonial accounts. Amina was born into the royal family of Zazzau. Her grandfather had been a famed ruler, and her mother, Queen Bakwa Turonku, is believed to have ruled before her, one of several female leaders of Zazzau, before Islamic norms began reshaping gender roles in the region. From a young age, Amina was trained not in weaving or court rituals, but in military strategy, politics, and horsemanship. She was said to have been fearless, often following warriors into the field as a teenager. Some legends say that she trained with the royal guards and earned their respect by outperforming male rivals. When her brother Karama died, Amina took power, but not merely as a ruler in name. She declared herself Queen of Zazzau, and within months began organizing massive military campaigns. She would ultimately lead a standing army of over 20,000 soldiers, many of them cavalrymen, a feat nearly unheard of in the region at the time. Amina's conquests were sweeping. Over the course of her reign, she is said to have expanded Zazzau's territory across more than 34 cities, reaching as far as modern-day Ghana. Her armies conquered city after city, collecting tribute and securing trade routes, especially those linked to the lucrative trans-Saharan trade of gold, salt, and slaves. But it wasn't just her military feats that cemented her name in legend. Amina was also a builder. She constructed a series of defensive walls around every major city she conquered, a tactic that both symbolized her power and protected her holdings. These walls, known as Ganu Ormena, Amina's walls, still stand in parts of Nigeria today. Some reach heights of 6 to 10 feet and stretch for miles. In fact, architectural historians often regard her walls as one of the earliest large-scale military defense projects by an African woman. Not merely symbolic, but strategic. meant to secure her gains against rebellions and external attacks. But as with all powerful women in patriarchal societies, her legacy became tangled in stories of scandal and contradiction. One widespread legend claims that Amina never married. Instead, it says she would take a new lover from among her conquered enemies each night, only to have them executed the following morning to preserve her dignity and prevent political embarrassment. Historians largely view this tale as apocryphal, likely developed to explain or shame a powerful woman who refused to marry, who held absolute power, and who answered to no man. In many cultures, such figures are often demonized or eroticized, as their authority is seen as an affront to the expected order. Yet despite the myths, Amina's impact was very real. She secured the trade arteries of a region, imposed taxes and tribute systems, and helped transform Zaza into a dominant Haza state. Her reign represents not only a golden age for Zaria, but a critical period in the Islamic and political consolidation of the Sahel. Although Islam had reached the region centuries before, Amina's rule reflects a unique blend of traditional Hausa leadership and Islamic governance. She prayed before battles, consulted Islamic scholars, and upheld many of the faith's public duties. But her role as a female military commander was distinctly outside the growing orthodoxy, a reality that would later lead to her near erasure from Islamic scholarship. In time, as the Sokoto Caliphate rose in the 19th century and imposed stricter gender norms, women like Amina were recast as folklore rather than history. Their names were spoken in hushed admiration, but often without formal recognition in records written by male Islamic jurists. And yet she endured. Today, in the city of Zaria, her name graces universities, roads, and monuments. Nigerian children still learn about her in school, and African feminists have resurrected her image as a symbol of strength, leadership, and agency. Amina's story challenges assumptions about African history, about who held power, who made war, and who built empires. She reminds us that African women, far from passive figures, were often active architects of their world. Riders on horseback, wielders of law, speakers of command. As the dust settled on the walls she left behind, her legacy only grew taller. The battlefield looks different in every era. In medieval North Africa, it was scorched earth and cavalry charges. In 16th century Zazao, it was walls and war horses. But in mid-20th century Cairo, for one woman, the battleground was a courtroom, a prison cell, and the pages of a book. Her name was Zainab el-Ghazali, and she stood as a defiant voice against authoritarianism, secular oppression, and the silencing of Islamic identity, even when that resistance meant unimaginable personal suffering. Born in 1917 to a devout Muslim family in Egypt, Zainab al-Ghazali's early years were steeped in spiritual rigor and political awareness. Her father, a merchant, encouraged her to memorize the Quran by the age of 7 and nurtured a deep sense of religious conviction. But what set Zainab apart, even as a girl, was her refusal to accept passivity. At just 18, she founded the Muslim Women's Association, an organization that aimed to educate and mobilize women across Egypt in Islamic principles, not just domestic ones, but social, economic, and political dimensions of their faith. She began giving lectures, writing essays, and organizing public forums. Her voice carried not just in the mosque, but in the marketplace of political ideas. In an Egypt rapidly modernizing and secularizing under King Farouk and later President Gamal Abdel Nasser, such religious activism was seen as subversive, especially from a woman. But Zainab refused to retreat. Her association worked closely with the Muslim Brotherhood, though she retained a degree of independence. She wasn't content with symbolic gestures. She called for Sharia-based governance, political justice, and women's leadership, rooted in Islamic ethics. Then came the crackdown. In the early 960s, after a failed assassination attempt on Nasser, the government rounded up scores of Brotherhood members, both men and women. Zainab al-Ghazali was arrested in 1965, accused of conspiring against the state, and subjected to years of brutal imprisonment. But it is what she endured and how she wrote about it that immortalized her. Her memoir, Ayam min Hayati, Days from My Life, is not just a historical document, it's a testament of spiritual resistance, an unfiltered chronicle of state torture and personal resilience. She describes being dragged from her home in the night, interrogated, and thrown into a dungeon-like cell infested with rats. For days, she was left in darkness without food or water. She was subjected to mock executions, beatings, and threats of sexual violence. She was told to renounce her cause, to abandon her writings, to confess her role in political plots, but she refused. In one passage, she recalls reciting Quranic verses in her cell, not just as prayer, but as armor, a way to block out the agony and confusion of psychological torment. When asked why she remained loyal to her cause despite the pain, she wrote, "Because oppression cannot erase the truth, because torture cannot burn the soul that has surrendered to God." Her faith was not fragile devotion, but militant courage. She envisioned herself as a soldier of Islam, not with a blade or gun, but with principle, endurance, and clarity. The regime's goal was to break her spirit, but ironically they amplified her reach. When she was released in 1971, Zainab al-Ghazali emerged not broken but sanctified in the eyes of many Islamic conservatives and grassroots activists. Her memoirs spread across the Arab world, particularly among Islamic circles, where she was hailed as a martyr of conscience who survived the modern-day pharaohs. But Zainab's legacy is not without complication. To some, she is a paragon of Islamic feminism, a woman who asserted that piety and leadership are not mutually exclusive. To others, especially secular or liberal feminists, her support for patriarchal structures, like her endorsement of polygyny or women's domestic roles, make her a controversial figure. Yet no one denies her courage. Even her critics recognize that in an age when dissent meant disappearance, and when women were rarely allowed to shape political theology, Zainab stood alone, defiant, veiled, and unshakable. Her life offers a profound twist in our understanding of warriors. She never picked up a weapon. She never led an army. Yet in the shadows of her prison cell, in the silence after torture, she proved what so many emperors and tyrants have failed to learn. That conviction, if strong enough, outlasts chains. Zainab al-Ghazali's writings continue to inspire Islamic movements today, though often adapted for different purposes. Some cite her as proof that women can lead within religious frameworks. Others use her story to argue for stricter religious observance. But all recognize her as a pillar of faith-based resistance. And in that sense, she joins the ranks of history's most formidable women warriors, not because she took lives, but because she refused to surrender her own. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where jagged cliffs cast long shadows over ancient rock-hewn churches, there lingers the name of a woman both feared and revered. Her name was Gudit, also known as Yodit, and she has haunted East African history for over a millennium. Her story comes not from a single manuscript or dynasty, but from whispers of ruin and tales of flame. For she was a queen who, according to tradition, burned her way across an empire. Gudip's legend is one of the most chilling in African history. She is said to have lived during the 10th century, a time when the Aksumite Empire, one of the oldest Christian kingdoms in the world, was crumbling. Aksum had once been mighty, with trade routes stretching to Arabia and Rome, and coins bearing its name found as far as India. But by the time Gudip's legend emerged, Aksum was weakened by climate shifts, religious divisions, and internal decay. It is in this moment of decline that Gudip appears, as a destroyer, a rebel, a queen of fire. According to Ethiopian Christian chronicles, she was of pagan or Jewish descent, possibly a member of the Beta Israel community, a group of Ethiopian Jews who had lived in the region for centuries. Some sources call her a Christian apostate. Others describe her as an avenger seeking retribution for persecution. Whatever her true origins, her actions left no doubt. Gudip is said to have led a massive rebellion against the Aksumite kings. She swept through the northern highlands, sacking churches, burning monasteries, and toppling the capital. The most enduring claim is that she burned every church she came across, a campaign of cultural and religious destruction that shattered Aksum's legacy and ushered in a long period of fragmentation. Some traditions claim she ruled Ethiopia for 40 years, an astonishing feat for a woman in a deeply patriarchal society. During this time, she was said to have executed surviving Aksumite royals, exiled priests, and imposed her own rule. Brutal, feared, and absolute. But like so many powerful women who break norms, Gudip's image is wrapped in duality. To Ethiopian Christian tradition, she is almost demonic. A blasphemer, a queen of darkness who destroyed God's kingdom on earth. Some even liken her to Jezebel or Lilith, painted as a figure of chaos. In rural legends, she's portrayed riding a black horse under the moon, sword in one hand and flame in the other. The others, especially in Jewish and alternative oral traditions. Gudip is a freedom fighter, a figure of resistance against the dominance of a Christian elite that had marginalized other ethnic and religious groups. Historical evidence about her is scarce. There are no surviving inscriptions or contemporary biographies. And yet, her impact is undeniable. The centuries following her rule are known as Zemani Mesafint, the era of the princes, a time of decentralization when no single power held sway in Ethiopia. Gudip, it seems, had broken something that would take generations to rebuild. But Gudip was not alone in her defiance. Across Islamic North and West Africa, warrior women appeared again and again, sometimes as generals, sometimes as rebels, sometimes as shadows on the edge of written history. In the Sudanese kingdoms of Kush and Miro, long before Gudip's time, Kandakes, or Candaces, ruled as queen mothers and led armies into battle against Roman invaders. One such queen, possibly named Amanirenas, fought off Augustus Caesar's troops and negotiated favorable peace, a diplomatic and military feat rarely credited to women in classical sources. In Mali and Songhai, oral traditions hint at female leaders who organized village defenses, wielded political power, and engaged in ritual warfare. Their names often vanished, replaced by their roles, the mother of the priest, the wife of the chief. But their actions survived in stories passed from grandmother to granddaughter. In North Africa, the centuries after Gudip's fall saw periods of religious fluidity and Berber uprisings, some of which were led by women, particularly in local tribal governance and resistance against caliphal control. One such figure, though poorly recorded, was the daughter of a Berber sheikh who led cavalry units in Tunisia during the Fatimid expansion. Her name is lost, but her deeds are remembered in Amazic oral poems, the image of a woman in a white robe, riding at the head of 100 men, refusing to yield. These women, like Gudip, existed in the margins, written about only by enemies or remembered in fragments. They were often erased by both colonial historians and Islamic chroniclers, who viewed military leadership as incompatible with femininity and orthodoxy. And yet they endured, in stories, in place names, in whispered songs sung during field work or feast days. What binds them all, Gudip Amanirenas, the Candaces, the nameless rebel riders, is not just the fact that they were women who fought. It is that they fought from conviction, from within the folds of cultures that tried to define them as caretakers, not commanders. They were not anomalies. They were the natural response to injustice. Gudip's flames were not the last to sweep across East Africa, but hers were among the most feared. And though her name may not adorn monuments or churches, her legacy is carved in absence, in the ruins she left behind, and the empire she helped unmake. In that silence, there is a kind of power. The world into which Jeanne d'Arc was born was battered by war and riddled with doubt. In the year 1412, in a quiet village called Domremy, nestled along the borderlands of eastern France, a child came into the world under a sky that seemed as heavy as the soil. For nearly a century, France and England had been locked in the 100 Years' War, a brutal series of conflicts not only over territory but over the very soul of France. Armies burned towns, famine swept the countryside, and disease, still echoing from the Black Death, had hollowed out entire communities. The crown itself was contested, with Charles VII declared king in name only, unable to even reach his coronation site in Reims. And amidst this battered landscape, Joan grew up a peasant girl with no sword, no schooling, and no power. Her father was a farmer, her mother spun wool. Their thatch-roofed cottage sat near the village church, and Joan spent much of her time in quiet devotion. She was, by all accounts, deeply pious from a young age. Neighbors said she would sneak away to pray, sometimes alone for hours, her fingers running over worn wooden beads, her eyes lit by unseen visions. But one day, when she was about 13 years old, something changed. Joan would later recount this moment many times, always with a trembling voice. She was in the garden, near the old walnut tree. The sun glinted through the leaves in the hazy golden light of a late afternoon. And then a voice called out to her, not from her parents, not from the road, from the air, from the very air itself. She turned and saw what she believed was the figure of Saint Michael, cloaked in armor, his sword gleaming with divine light. And he spoke to her, not just as a child, but as a chosen one. He told her that France was in danger, and that she had been chosen by heaven to save it. In the days that followed, the visions continued. Saints Catherine and Margaret appeared, their voices calm but firm. They told her she must go to Charles, the rightful heir to the throne, and help him reclaim his kingdom. A teenage girl, tasked with saving a nation that had all but lost hope. At first, she kept the visions secret, but something inside her began to shift. Her quiet prayers grew louder. Her eyes seemed filled with fire. She began speaking openly about her divine mission, to the bewilderment of her family. They tried to stop her. Her father threatened to drown her if she left home. Her neighbors laughed. What could a girl do? She couldn't read. She didn't know how to ride a horse. She had never even seen a battlefield. But Joan did not waver, because her faith was louder than fear. In 1428, she convinced a local garrison commander at Vaucouleurs to let her speak to Charles. He dismissed her, but she returned again and again. Her persistence, her eerie confidence, and her uncanny presence began to unsettle even hardened soldiers. Eventually, the commander relented. He gave her a horse and a small escort. She cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothes, and set off across enemy-held territory. A teenage girl disguised as a soldier, carrying nothing but a sword, a letter, and an unshakable belief that she had been sent by God. She reached Chinon, where Charles was hiding in exile. When she was brought before him, he hid among his courtiers, dressed as a servant, to test her. But Joan, never having seen him, walked straight to the disguised heir, dropped to one knee, and said, "Gentle Dauphin, my name is Jeanne the Maid. I am sent by God to help you reclaim your kingdom." That moment stunned the court. Some thought her a prophet, others a sorceress. The church investigated her claims, interrogated her knowledge of scripture, and watched for signs of heresy. But she was unshakable, quoting saints and doctrine with the fluency of a priest, though she could neither read nor write. And perhaps more importantly, she gave the people hope. France was crumbling, its armies demoralized, its nobles bickering, and here stood a girl, barely 17, claiming divine mandate, speaking with a voice that made even bishops fall silent. Charles, desperate for any glimmer of salvation, agreed to let her accompany his army to Orléans, a city under siege by the English. She was given armor, a banner, and command, not in name but in inspiration. The soldiers followed her not because she held rank, but because she carried conviction. As she mounted her horse for the first time in full armor, her feet barely reaching the stirrups, the troops whispered, "The maid rides with us now. God is on our side." She rode not with bloodlust, but with purity, never striking a blow, but carrying the standard, urging soldiers onward with calls of faith and freedom. And it worked. Her presence alone transformed despair into courage. The city of Orleans had been choking for months under English siege. Once a proud stronghold of the French kingdom, it now trembled behind battered walls. Its people prayed, not for victory, but simply for the siege to end, even if that meant surrender. But on a clear spring morning in April 1429, a curious sight appeared beyond the horizon. A banner fluttered in the wind. a white flag with golden lilies and the figure of Christ holding the world. And beneath it, clad in armor, rode a young woman, her eyes fixed ahead, her voice steady and strange in the cool morning air. Joan of Arc had arrived. She did not storm the city with brute force. She entered with purpose, carrying not just weapons, but certainty. Her presence alone stirred the starving defenders. She spoke to the captains with unflinching confidence, told them the siege would be lifted, and demanded they fight with her, for God had already granted them victory. At first the commanders were skeptical. Who is this girl to give orders? But she walked the ramparts, spoke to soldiers, and prayed aloud where the wounded lay. Some said her voice calmed the dying. Others believed they saw a halo when she passed. She led the French troops in a series of lightning assaults on English fortifications surrounding Orléans. She rode at the front, never wielding a weapon, but holding high her banner, a sign of divine favor. At the siege of Les Tourelles, one of the most decisive battles, Joan was struck by an arrow between the neck and shoulder. The wound was deep and bled profusely. Her men begged her to retreat, but she stood, pulled the arrow out herself, and returned to the battlefield by nightfall. Within days, the English abandoned Orleans. The unthinkable had happened, and the Maid of Domremy had done it. Joan's fame spread like wildfire. No longer a curious girl in armor, she had become a national symbol, a living miracle. Wherever she went, villagers wept, soldiers cheered, and clergy whispered about prophecy. Even hardened mercenaries kissed the hem of her cloak. Next came the march to Reims, where Charles VII would be crowned at last. The city had been held by the English, but towns fell in succession as Joan's presence inspired defections and disarray among the enemy. Her divine mission seemed unstoppable. In July 1429, Charles was finally crowned King of France, with Joan standing beside him, the peasant girl in white armor, holding her banner higher than any sword. But glory breeds envy, and miracles often meet resistance. The French court, once desperate, now grew wary of her power. Nobles resented being overshadowed by a teenage girl. Bishops questioned her visions. Even Charles, newly crowned, began to distance himself from the maid. Yet Joan pressed on. She insisted on liberating Paris, still held by English and Burgundian forces. But Charles hesitated, unwilling to commit. When she attacked without full support, the effort failed. She was wounded again and forced to retreat. It was her first major setback, and whispers began to grow that perhaps the maid's favor was fading. In May 1430, while attempting to defend the town of Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces. She expected rescue. She believed the king she had helped crown would ransom her. But no one came. She was sold to the English. Her trial for heresy began in Rouen. It was not a trial in the true sense, but an inquisition orchestrated to humiliate and destroy her. Over 70 clerics and lawyers examined her, seeking contradictions, aiming to trap her. But Joan, though uneducated, confounded them. When asked if she was in God's grace, a trick question intended to condemn her either way, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Her replies, cool and unwavering, echoed through the court. But her fate was sealed long before she spoke. The English could not allow her to live. She had not only defeated them in battle, but she had also defied gender, class, and authority. They accused her of witchcraft, of wearing men's clothes, of claiming visions from God. The same clothes that had protected her in battle were now a charge of sin. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. Witnesses said she asked for a cross as the flames rose. A sympathetic soldier made one from sticks and handed it to her. She clutched it until the fire took her hands. As the smoke swirled, those nearby heard her final word. Jesus. After her execution, even her enemies felt unease. The executioner reportedly said he feared he had burned a saint. Decades later, a posthumous trial overturned her conviction. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, Joan of Arc was canonized by the Catholic Church. Today, she remains one of the most studied, celebrated, and controversial figures in Western history. A peasant girl who led armies, a martyr, a saint, and above all, a reminder that faith, courage, and conviction need no crown to change the world. In the early 13th century, England trembled under civil war. The First Barons' War raged between supporters of King John and rebel nobles who invited the French Prince Louis to claim the English throne. Castles were falling like dominoes across the countryside. But in one city, amid its cobbled streets and fortified stone walls, stood a woman who refused to surrender. Her name was Nicola de la Haye. Born around the year 1150, Nicola was the daughter of a nobleman and the granddaughter of Castellan officers, those who held responsibility for castles on behalf of the crown. From an early age, Nicola was steeped in the duties of estate management, diplomacy, and, unusually for a woman of her time, military responsibility. When her father died, she inherited the role of Castellan of Lincoln Castle, making her one of the few women in English history to hold such a powerful position. Her appointment wasn't symbolic. Nicola commanded troops, oversaw defenses, and stood equal among male lords in the volatile politics of King John's England. The medieval world wasn't kind to women in power. To rule as a woman, not just as a regent or queen by marriage, but as a military leader, meant constantly proving one's legitimacy. Nicola, however, seemed born for the storm. When John came to power in 1199, he not only recognized her role, he confirmed her as Sheriff of Lincolnshire, the king's personal agent in a vast and turbulent region, and the king's two attendants. As the king's sheriff, however, the lead gentlemen were ready and waiting. Her loyalty to John was unwavering, and he trusted her deeply. She defended Lincoln Castle during a siege in 1216, when forces loyal to the rebel barons and Prince Louis tried to take the city. Though in her mid-60s, Nicola refused to yield. She rallied her garrison, reinforced the walls, and organized the resistance with such tenacity that the rebels failed to capture the stronghold. But the war was far from over. When King John died later that year, his 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited the crown. The regents who ruled in his name desperately needed allies to hold key royal fortresses. Nicola, now a veteran of sieges, once again took command of Lincoln Castle, which sat in a strategic position guarding the road to the north. In 1217, the greatest threat came. A massive force of French knights and English rebels, led by Thomas, Count of Perche, surrounded the castle. The city of Lincoln had already been captured. The French believed that with the town under control, the castle would fall easily. But they were wrong. Nicola, now close to 70 years old, gathered her garrison and closed the gates. Her defenders were outnumbered, and the enemy began constructing siege engines to batter down the walls. From her stone tower, Nicola watched as ladders and catapults were dragged into place. She sent messages to the regent, William Marshal, pleading for relief. But while she waited, she prepared to hold. Food was rationed. Arrows were fletched. Walls were reinforced with whatever materials could be found. The castle's chapel became a place of both prayer and triage, where wounded soldiers were treated and frightened servants comforted. Despite bombardments and growing pressure, Nicola held firm, and on May 17, salvation arrived. William Marshal, leading a royal army of knights, launched a surprise attack on the besieging forces. A fierce battle unfolded both inside and outside the city walls. English longbowmen fired volleys from the towers. Nicola's garrison opened the gates to let in reinforcements at just the right moment. The French troops, caught between two fires, panicked. The siege was broken, and Lincoln was saved. But Nicola's story didn't end with victory. Despite her loyalty and success, when male courtiers regained influence under Henry III, they tried to remove her from power. The new justiciar attempted to strip her of her role as Castellan. Nicola would have none of it. She wrote directly to the king, asserting her lifelong service, her oaths of loyalty, and her right to hold the castle. Her words were direct, persuasive, and unapologetic. Incredibly, she won. Henry III reinstated her authority, and reaffirmed her as custodian. She remained castellan of Lincoln Castle until her death in 1230, one of the longest-serving and most formidable women in English medieval history. Today, Nicola de la Haye is barely remembered. No grand monuments honor her, no epic songs recount her stand. Yet in the silence of Lincoln's ancient towers, one can still imagine her, aged, armored, and unyielding, watching the horizon for the next army, her banner flapping against the wind. She was not a queen, she had no army of her own, and yet she stood when others would have fled. Her strength was not in numbers, but in will, the kind of will that builds legends and defends kingdoms. High in the Apennine Mountains of northern Italy, where fortresses crown ridgelines like thrones carved into the sky, there once ruled a woman so formidable that popes sought her favor, emperors feared her army, and generations later, she would be remembered as the woman who bent a king to his knees. Her name was Matilda of Canossa. Born in 1046, Matilda was the daughter of Boniface III, the powerful Margrave of Tuscany, and Beatrice of Lorraine, a noblewoman of immense political acuity. From a young age, Matilda was tutored not just in prayer and courtly manners, but in languages, law, theology, and, unusually for her time, military strategy. By her teenage years, she could speak Latin, understood church law, and had begun to train in horsemanship and arms. Her family controlled vast swaths of northern and central Italy, a region critical in the bitter rivalry between the Holy Roman Emperors and the papacy. When her father and brother died suddenly in the 1050 S, Matilda inherited the lands and the burden of their defense. As a teenage girl, she now ruled one of the most strategic political entities in Europe. And she did not flinch. She took up the sword and the seal with equal ease. Her fortresses became rallying points for loyal knights and monks alike. Her court became a haven for reformist clergy, those fighting against the corruption and secular control of the church. And she, more than any other secular ruler, would come to define the course of the investiture controversy, a power struggle between the Pope and the Emperor over who held the right to appoint bishops. At the heart of this battle stood two towering men, Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, and between them stood Matilda. When Henry demanded control of the church and moved to depose Gregory, Matilda did the unthinkable. She sided with the Pope. She offered Gregory refuge in her castles, deployed her troops in defense of his claims, and pledged her allegiance to spiritual over imperial authority. Henry was furious. He marched into Italy, determined to crush resistance. But winter in the Apennines is no easy enemy. In 1077, in one of the most dramatic moments in medieval European history, Henry was forced to stand barefoot in the snow outside Matilda's castle at Canossa, seeking forgiveness from Pope Gregory, who had excommunicated. For 3 days, the emperor stood outside the gates, humiliated and frozen, until Matilda persuaded the Pope to accept his penance. This moment, the walk to Canossa, became a symbol of papal authority and Matilda's incredible political weight. Though she had not lifted a sword, she had orchestrated an emperor's submission. But Matilda was no stranger to battle either. As Henry regrouped and launched campaigns against papal supporters, Matilda led armies across Tuscany. She directed sieges, defended mountain passes, and even donned armor herself, riding at the head of her troops, her sword raised not for conquest, but for defiance. In one famous encounter near the Po River, she outmaneuvered a superior imperial force by luring them into narrow marshlands, where their cavalry became useless. Her forces struck with precision and routed the enemy, sending a message to all of Europe. The Countess of Canossa was no mere noblewoman. She ruled for decades not as a regent for a male heir, but as sovereign in her own right. She negotiated with kings, donated land to the papacy, and even constructed monasteries and hospitals. Her patronage of learning helped preserve crucial theological texts, and her castles, perched like sentinels along trade and war routes, were fortresses of both defense and culture. Late in life, she was offered the title of Imperial Vicar and Vice Queen of Italy by Emperor Henry V. an astonishing reversal of the role she played in humiliating his father. She accepted the honor, but made clear that her loyalty remained first with her people and with Rome. Matilda died in 1115 at the age of 69. Her legacy was immense. For centuries, her story was almost erased from mainstream chronicles, overshadowed by kings and crusaders. But in the dusty parchment of abbey libraries and carved into the stone lintels of mountain castles, her name endures. Not as a consort, not as a mother, not as a bride of Christ, but as a warrior, a diplomat, and a sovereign who defended both her lands and her beliefs with unshakable strength. In the highlands of South America, where mountains brush the sky and rivers snake through mist-wrapped valleys, a woman once rode at the head of a rebel cavalry, sword raised, hair flying, eyes lit like the storm. Her name was Juana Azurduy, and though time and empire tried to forget her, the soil remembers. The stones remember, and tonight we remember. She was born in Chuquisaca, modern-day Sucre, Bolivia, in 1780, when the Andes still echoed under the weight of Spanish rule. Her blood was both Spanish and indigenous Quechua, a living blend of two worlds in conflict. From her earliest years, she felt the pull of rebellion. Her mother died young. Her father was assassinated for resisting land theft. Orphaned by the age of 14, Juana was sent to a convent, where she was expected to be quiet, obedient, and holy. She did not stay long. She fled the cloistered walls and returned to the land, learning to ride horses, wield weapons, and speak Quechua and Aymara with the people who would become her comrades. She did not care for lace or courtly fans. She cared for justice. In time, she married Manuel Padilla, a local revolutionary leader. But Juana was no passive wife. She rode alongside him, fought alongside him, bled alongside him. When the wars of independence erupted across South America, Juana was ready. By 1809, she had joined the guerrilla resistance against the Spanish crown. She was not just a fighter, she became a commander, leading bands of indigenous soldiers, women warriors, and former peasants through mountain passes and jungle paths. They called themselves the Loyal Battalions of the Homeland, and Juana was their iron heart. She wore a crimson military coat, often mounted on a warhorse, her curved sword glinting in the sun. She had 4 children, all of them lost to war or illness, but she never left the battlefield. Grief became armor. Her fight was not just political, it was deeply personal. In 1811, she led a daring raid to recapture a Spanish-held hilltop fortress. When the smoke cleared, it was Juana Azurduy who planted the rebel flag. For this, the revolutionary government awarded her the title of Lieutenant Colonel, the first woman in Bolivian history to earn military rank in open combat. But she was not finished. When her husband was captured and beheaded by Spanish loyalists, Juana did not retreat. She took full command of his troops, and they followed her without question. Spanish generals wrote with frustration about that cursed woman whose cavalry appeared and vanished like ghosts in the mountains. She used guerrilla tactics, ambush, sabotage, stealth, long before they became textbook military strategies. At one point, her forces captured an entire enemy garrison, seizing horses, rifles, ammunition, and food to keep her rebellion alive. And still, she rode on. But the war was long. Resources ran thin. Promises from political leaders in Buenos Aires and Lima often came too late or not at all. By the 1820s, much of the revolutionary elite had forgotten her. They celebrated victories in salons and plazas, while Juana, bruised, exhausted, grieving, continued to fight in the highlands. She lived to see Bolivia's independence in 1825. She even met Simón Bolívar, the famed liberator himself. He greeted her with respect, reportedly saying, "This country should not be named Bolivia, but Azurduy in honor of this brave woman." But the newly formed republic had little room for women warriors. Juana Azurduy died poor and forgotten in 1862, buried in an unmarked grave. For over a century, her name was nearly lost to dust. But history, real history, has a way of resurfacing. In the 20th century, women and indigenous activists unearthed her story and gave it back to the people. She became a symbol of resilience, of resistance, of a mother who gave everything for her land. Today, her ashes rest in a bronze tomb in Sucre, where the Bolivian state honors her as a national hero. Her face appears on coins and statues. Schools bear her name, and in Argentina, in 2015, a towering monument of Juana Azurduy was unveiled, sword in hand, hair wild, gaze unflinching. She was not a myth, she was real. A general in red, a mother with a broken heart, a leader on horseback rising through the clouds. And when the winds sweep through the high Andean passes, they still whisper her name. Juana. Not forgotten. Never again. In the searing sun of 17th century West Central Africa, the forested hills of the kingdom of Ndongo shimmered with danger. Portuguese muskets cracked in the distance, missionaries sought converts with one hand and slaves with the other, and local rulers found themselves torn between resistance and survival. And rising above them all stood Queen Nzinga, diplomat, warrior, and queen of not just one, but two kingdoms. Born around 1583, Nzinga was the daughter of the Ngola king of Ndongo, located in present-day Angola. From a young age, she showed an unusual grasp of statecraft and languages, quickly learning Portuguese and mastering the customs of both her Kimbundu people and the foreign invaders. Her intelligence and poise made her a trusted envoy even before she formally ruled. The year 1622 marked a turning point. The Portuguese, expanding their territory along the Atlantic coast, sought to dominate the Ndongo kingdom and extract enslaved Africans to fuel Brazil's plantations. Desperate to halt their advance, Nzinga's brother sent her as his representative to negotiate peace. Nzinga walked into the hall of the Portuguese governor in Luanda, draped in silks and beads, her back straight, her eyes unblinking. Yet when she entered, she found no seat provided, a deliberate insult to suggest her inferiority. Without hesitation, she signaled to one of her servants, who knelt on all fours. Nzinga sat on the servant's back, her posture regal, her voice measured. She would not be humiliated. This act was not just defiance. It was a message. You will not rule me by gesture or trick. The negotiation ended in a fragile peace, but it did not last. In the years that followed, Nzinga's brother died, possibly by suicide, possibly by murder. Nzinga took power and declared herself queen. Many opposed a woman's rule, but Nzinga consolidated power quickly, sometimes ruthlessly. She executed rivals, married strategically, and gathered a loyal court of warriors and advisors, including women who trained alongside men in the arts of war. When Portuguese betrayal came again, Nzinga went underground, both politically and literally. She formed alliances with the Imbangala, a fierce nomadic warrior group. With them, she launched a series of brilliant guerrilla campaigns, striking Portuguese forts, cutting supply lines, and retreating into the bush before counterattacks could land. But Nzinga was not content with hit-and-run tactics. She envisioned an empire of her own. In 1631, she captured the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, installing herself as queen and shifting her base of power eastward. There, she rebuilt her army, established a new capital, and began writing letters to European powers, even the Pope, seeking diplomatic recognition. Over time, Nzinga used Christianity as a political tool, converting when it suited her and renouncing it when it did not. She adopted Portuguese-style clothing at court, but maintained indigenous religious rights. She played the roles demanded by European diplomacy, yet never ceased being herself. One of the most remarkable aspects of Nzinga's reign was her longevity. For over 30 years she fought and ruled, enduring multiple invasions, betrayals, and shifting alliances. She personally led troops into battle, even into her 60s. In one legendary account, when Portuguese forces laid siege to her stronghold, Nzinga disguised herself and escaped into the mountains, rallying her followers and retaking her capital by subterfuge. Her enemies called her a savage, Her people called her a lioness. Toward the end of her life, she negotiated a lasting peace with Portugal, not as a conquered subject, but as an equal. She ensured Matamba remained a sovereign state, and she laid the groundwork for her successors to rule without direct European interference. Nzinga died in 1663 at the age of 80. Her funeral combined Christian and traditional rituals. Her legacy, however, transcended both. Today, she is revered in Angola as a national hero, her name spoken with reverence in stories, songs, and statues. She represents not just a queen, but a spirit of resistance, of cunning, of courage. The winds that roll across the plains of Tamil Nadu carry whispers of royal courts and ancient temples, of spice merchants and poets, and, if you listen closely, of a queen whose wrath burned brighter than the British cannons. Her name was Velu Nachiar, born in 1730, the only daughter of the royal house of Ramanathapuram in southern India. She was not raised in the shadows of male heirs. Her father, a wise and forward-thinking king, ensured that Velu was trained in languages, diplomacy, martial arts, and even swordsmanship and archery. From childhood, she studied silambam, a Tamil martial art involving the staff and flexible weapons. She learned Sanskrit, Urdu, and French, not as decoration, but for governance. She trained with horses and elephants, walked barefoot through the jungles, and listened to her generals as much as to her priests. By the time she married Muthu Vaduganatha Periya Vudaya, the Var, king of Sivaganga, Velu Nachiar was not merely a consort. She was a partner in rulership. But tragedy came swiftly. In 1772, the British East India Company, aided by the forces of the Nawab of Arcot, attacked Sivaganga. The king was killed, the palace burned, the city was ransacked. Velu Nachiar fled into the forests with her young daughter and a small group of loyalists. She was not broken. She was waiting. For 8 years, she traveled between the shadows, gathering allies, storing weapons, and planning a return. She found refuge among the Marudu brothers, skilled military leaders who pledged their swords to her cause. She formed alliances with local rulers and sought support from Hyder Ali, the powerful Sultan of Mysore, who provided her with arms and troops. This queen was no passive figurehead. She trained her soldiers, drilled formations, and coordinated attacks. She adopted guerrilla tactics, striking supply lines, raiding armories, vanishing into hills. She moved not like royalty, but like a general. And then she struck. In 1780, Velu Nachiar launched her offensive to retake Sivaganga. Among her forces was an elite women's battalion, many of them widows of fallen warriors. These women, trained in stealth and fire, became known as the Udaya Regiment, named after a loyal servant who had once sacrificed herself for the queen. At the heart of the plan was an act of fire, an early suicide bombing, long before the term existed. One of Velu Nachiar's loyalists, Kuyili, soaked herself in ghee, clarified butter, hid a torch in her garments, and charged the British gunpowder store. She set herself ablaze and detonated the entire stockpile, allowing Velu's army to breach the walls. Sivaganga fell, not to a man, but to a mother and a widow, a queen and a commander. Velu Nachiar reclaimed her throne and ruled for the next 10 years. She revived trade, reopened temples, supported education, and maintained an independent army. She remained wary of British treaties and kept her kingdom outside the company's expanding control, a feat rare in that era. Her daughter, Valachi, was groomed to succeed her, and when Velu stepped down in 1790, she ensured a smooth transition, one led by women, for a land that had been denied both peace and dignity. Velu Nachiar died in 1796, her story largely erased from the colonial chronicles. But today in southern India, she is honored with statues and songs. Tamil scholars call her Veeramangai, the brave woman. She is remembered as the first Indian queen to wage war against the British, decades before the names of Lakshmibai or the leaders of 1857 would echo in nationalist movements. Yet her fire, both literal and symbolic, still glows in memory. In the heart of West Africa, beneath the canopy of golden palms and humid skies, lies the story of a queen who did not wear a crown of jewels or silk robes, but one of fire, grit, and ancient dignity. Her name was Ya Asantewaa, and when the British threatened the very soul of her people, she stood up when others stayed seated. The year was 1900, and the Ashanti Empire, now part of modern-day Ghana, had already suffered decades of British interference. The empire was once one of the most formidable powers in West Africa, an intricate society built on gold, military might, and spiritual unity. Central to that unity was not a king or a constitution, but a stool, the Golden Stool, believed to house the very spirit of the Ashanti nation. This stool, carved in gold and never meant to touch the ground, was not just a throne, it was sacred. It symbolized the soul of the Ashanti people, past, present, and future. To demand it was to demand ownership over their very being. And that is exactly what the British governor Sir Frederick Hodgson did. After already exiling King Pembe and his advisors to the Seychelles, Hodgson summoned Ashanti leaders and demanded the golden stool be brought to him to sit upon, claiming it as a symbol of British authority. It was an outrage. Men of the Ashanti Council, shocked and dishonored, returned in silence. But not Ya Asantewaa. The respected Queen Mother of Ejisu, Ya Asantewaa, was already a figure of wisdom, known for her shrewd governance and deep knowledge of tradition. But what came next made her eternal. She stood before the council and said, "Is it true that the bravery of the Ashanti is no more? I cannot believe it. If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women, and we will fight the white men. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields." With those words, she became commander-in-chief of the Ashanti resistance. And for the first time in history, a woman would lead an entire African kingdom into war against a European empire. Ya Asantewaa was in her 60s. She wore no uniform. She had no Western military training. But what she had was fire, and that was enough. He gathered thousands of Ashanti fighters, built fortifications around Kumasi, and laid siege to the British fort where Hodgson and his troops had taken shelter. For months, she led what came to be known as the War of the Golden Stool, organizing supply lines, directing tactics, and refusing to surrender even when British reinforcements landed from the coast. She turned villages into strategic camps. She inspired not just warriors, but mothers, children, and elders. The British called her a rebel, but to her people, she was a lioness. They never gave the stool. Eventually, after fierce resistance, the British broke the siege. Kumasi was bombarded. Ashanti towns were burned. Ya Asantewaa was captured, but even in defeat, she did not bow. She was exiled to the Seychelles, where she spent her final years, far from her homeland, surrounded by tropical seas that could never wash away her defiance. She died in 1921. In exile, her body never returned to the land she had defended so fiercely. But her spirit lived on. In 1957, when Ghana became the first African country to gain independence from colonial rule, her name was spoken alongside the founding fathers. Statues rose in her honor. Schools were named after her. Songs still echo her words. And the Golden Stool? It remains with the Ashanti, untouched by foreign hands. Ya Asantewaa remains a symbol not only of resistance, but of dignity, cultural pride, and the power of a woman to lead when it matters most. She did not fight for conquest. She fought so her people would not forget who they were. And in that, she won. As our story comes to a close, we leave behind the echoes of war cries, the rustle of silk beneath armor, and the quiet footsteps of women who shaped the world from behind veils, walls, and battle lines. These were not myths nor forgotten shadows. They were real women of flesh and breath and fire. From frozen fjords to desert sands, from jungle strongholds to marble palaces, they carried swords, scrolls, and burdens. And they carried them with grace. They trained like soldiers, thought like rulers, mourned like mothers, and resisted like legends. In remembering them, we do more than honor history. We opened our hearts to a truth long silenced, that the past was never shaped by men alone. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, take comfort in knowing that history sleeps beside you, soft and vast, full of untold stories waiting to rise like the sun. Thank you for watching. If this journey moved you, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and which warrior inspired you most. Every message means more than you know. Until next time, sleep deeply and dream boldly. Good night.